Our reading today is entitled The Butterfly, and it is from Zorba the Greek. I remember one morning when I discovered a cocoon in the back of a tree, just as a butterfly was making a hole in its case and preparing to come out. I waited a while, but it was too long appearing, and I was impatient. I bent over it and breathed on it to warm it. I warmed it as quickly as I could, and the miracle began to happen before my eyes, faster than life. The case opened, the butterfly started slowly crawling out, and I shall never forget my horror when I saw how its wings were folded back and crumpled. The wretched butterfly tried with its whole trembling body to unfold them. Bending over it, I tried to help with my breath in vain. It needed to be hatched out patiently, and the unfolding of the wings should be a gradual process in the sun. Now it was too late. My breath had forced the butterfly to appear all crumpled before its time. It struggled desperately, and a few seconds later died in the palm of my hand. That little body is, I do believe, the greatest weight I have on my conscience. For I realize today that it is a mortal sin to violate the great laws of nature. We should not hurry. We should not be impatient. But we should confidently obey the eternal rhythm.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for that reading. If I were to compile my own personal collection of scriptures, I would include this reading by Nikos Kazantzakis from Zorba the Greek. Like any meaningful scriptural passage, here's a reading that I could turn to again and again and find new meaning. Like any meaningful scriptural passage, this one reminds me of so many seemingly enduring and essential messages. For me, the messages in this passage from Zorba the Greek include the process of unfolding in nature and in our lives must not be forced. For when we rush through life, we may lose so much of what could happen in its unfolding process. We must come to appreciate those eternal rhythms in nature that don't really require any real effort on our part, but only a willingness to participate with them. The hurriedness that is so prevalent, so easy to imbibe in this culture that we live in, can, whether we realize it or not, and mostly we don't realize it, could bring about more harm than good. Now, I don't seek to convince any of you of these truths that I need to be reminded of again and again. I will let the story speak for itself. I will let the story speak to you in its own way for you to find your response to this poignant event in the reading. But I will hold up that final sentence from the reading once more, to let it resonate in this room, to let it resonate within you, and to resonate among us once again. We should not hurry. We should not be impatient, but we should confidently obey the eternal rhythm. Let's pause in a meditative way as we let those words savor within us. Or as the Quakers say, find how these words may speak to your own condition. We should not hurry. We should not be impatient, but we should confidently obey the eternal rhythm. I said as I began, I would enter this reading into my own compilation of scriptures. Perhaps you have your own set of readings from official scriptures and or from other scriptures of your own fashioning. If not, I hope that you'll start compiling those readings that you could return to again and again. Perhaps your own compilation can become gentle reminders to you, can be intentional ways to cultivate your own soul, could hold you, could inspire you, encourage you, and challenge you in the living of your days. Perhaps if a number of us begin to gather our own compilation of readings, personal scriptures, in a 3-ring notebook, in an electronic file, on Post-it notes, that sometime next spring we could have a service in which we hear some of these readings from one another. Okay? I suspect that the readings and the poems that speak to you could speak to many of us as well. I first got this idea of compiling one's own scriptures in the late 1980s when I attended I was alive then, when I attended a training with Ira Progoff, the depth psychologist from whom I learned his method of the intensive journal and process meditation. During that training, when he was in his early 70s, he gave for me what was a stunning account of some of the despair in his own life following the devastations and the atrocities of World War II. Progoff, you see, was the son of Russian Jews. He grew up in Brooklyn. He served in the army during the World War II, and he returned to do his doctorate at the New School for Social Research in New York City. He found himself contemplating some of the horrific events of the war, and in particular, he was haunted by the image of the Nazi book burnings. He wondered, what would have happened to civilization if the world's sacred scriptures and books of wisdom had actually been destroyed? It was a question that haunted him until he came to understand that if these books had all been destroyed, that actually, in his words, the depths out of which these scriptures came could not be destroyed. He came to assert that the individual depths could continue and give rise, if they must, to new Bibles, new scriptures that could capture our emerging spiritual insights for ourselves as individuals or for our ongoing civilization. Progoff went on to study many of the world's scriptures. He recognized that the Bibles of history did not always speak, however, to the modern human with the same power that they may have to previous generations. So he went on to develop methods, one of which was the intensive journal, which brought me to my study with him. The method arose out of his study of creative people and the way certain methods of journaling could allow each person to tap into the depths of their own self and to connect with the gradual unfolding of spiritual and personal insight. Progoff went on to train those who worked in hospitals, mental health clinics, schools, synagogues, churches, and prisons to help people from all walks of life to engage more fully with their lives as a whole and with an emerging meaning that comes through this kind of reflective practice. His approach incorporates a deep appreciation of the underlying process of our lives rather than just the events of our lives. Sometimes we get fixated on a particular event in our life and we don't realize that that is only a stepping stone in an ongoing list of stepping stones by which we travel our days. In other words, in his method, his aim is not to just log events, but to feel the movement underlying those events. His is what is called a holistic depth psychology, since in the process one taps into fact and feeling, thought and intuition, image and circumstance, in order to participate in one's own unfolding of being in relationship with one's life, or, in using his words, in dialogue with our life as a whole. His is not merely a theoretical perspective of the dynamic, continual evolution of the individual or a civilization or society, but it is an engagement, a direct engagement with our life in such a way that, in his words, we come to understand that, and I quote, "We are dancers, joining the dance of our life as it is going on and continuing it towards its fulfillment." I'll add that to my personal scriptures as well. I'll add that verse to my personal scriptures as well. We are dancers, joining the dance of our life as it is going on and continuing it toward its fulfillment. So I felt led this morning to speak about giving intentional attention to our inner processes of change, since much of our efforts in the last several months have been rightly and so intensely focused on responding to the threatening forces in our external culture that could continue to erode our democracy, perpetuate violence against LGBTQ people, deny women reproductive freedom, ignore the climate emergency that we're in, perpetuate racism, make senseless gun violence more prevalent, and so on. All of these need our attention, and we will continue to rise up to these external challenges. We will organize our efforts to vote and to get out the vote. We will organize for legislation. We will continue to seek and advocate for all so that many might benefit to our attention to the common good. We know all too well that the struggle for a world of justice, a world that works for all, is not done. That the struggle continues in our country, and as we've been reminded in recent weeks, in many places around the world as we reflected on the UU Service Committee's work. And yet alongside all of these necessary, essential, and resilient efforts, we also, in my opinion, have to do the inner work of gradual transformation. Not instead of, but in addition to all of our efforts to change the world. We also have to do the inner work that can also sustain our efforts, strengthen our spirits, and renew our resolve about the holiness of life itself. Abraham Joshua Heschel reminds us of this essential wisdom that we can often forget in our busyness and our hurriedness. Just to be is a blessing. Just to live is holy. I'll enter that verse in my personal scriptures as well. As Gandhi reminds us, we have to be the change we want to see, and that requires inner transformation as well. As we examine the life of some of our most admired social activists and social reformers, Gandhi, Mandela, Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, Ida Wells, they drew upon a strong inner self and they drew strength from a community. They drew upon a strong faith as a grounding for their work in the world. And it's no different for any of us if we really, truly want to make a difference in this world. Yet we have to be patient with ourselves. Nothing will happen immediately. We have to cultivate that strength within us and that patience within us, since we will not necessarily see immediate results. That inner work alongside of our work in the world go hand in hand with one another. The wisdom from the Kazantzakis reading, we should not hurry, we should not be impatient, but we should confidently obey the eternal rhythm, reminds me of the work that the psychologist David Elkin raised almost 25 years ago about the hurrying nature of our culture. In his book, The Hurried Child, David Elkin called our attention to all the ways in particular that we hurry our children through life. Could someone hurry and turn off that fan in the back? Thank you. So in his book, The Hurried Child, David Elkin called our attention to all the ways in particular that we hurry our children through life. In one synopsis, it says that Elkin called our attention to the crippling effects of hurrying our child through life. He showed that by blurring the boundaries of what is age appropriate, by expecting or imposing too much too soon, we force our kids to grow up too fast, to mimic adult sophistication while they secretly yearn for a time to act their age. It's been 2 decades plus since Elkin's book was published. And the fact of it is, he proclaims, we've stepped up the assault on childhood through our hurrying approaches prevalent in schools, the internet, the wider culture, movies and television, and school violence. This prompted Elkin to issue a 25-year anniversary edition of the same book, in which he offers parents and teachers and others some new advice. But I can't help but think that we are all, whether we are parents or teachers, we are all complicit in this hurriedness in our culture. We are hurriedly and busily moving through our days. I even keep hearing from some of the retired folks in our congregation, and I quote, "Larry, I'm busier than I have ever been." Right? You know who you are. Someone's whispering in the back and saying, well, I might be busier, but I don't hurry as much as I used to. In fact, I have to admit that I personally could probably write a sequel to Elkin's book entitled The Hurried Child Who Never Stopped Hurrying. Oh, let me take a breath, say that again. The Hurried Child Who Never Stopped Hurrying. Phew. Anyone here believe they could co-author that book with me? See a few hands? Okay, thank you. I'll call on you. Could it be that many of us are like that character Zorba, trying to hurry the caterpillar along? Why is it that we often seem to have our foot on the accelerator when we may need to be pumping the brakes a little bit more? Of course, life has its own way of reminding us to appreciate the wisdom of Zorba's words. Life has its way of reminding us to confidently obey the eternal rhythm. Sometimes illness or grief or losses of many kinds bring us to a pausing place. that otherwise would not have occurred in our hurried lives. And I also believe that we can create intentional ways to pause, to savor, to reflect, to make sense of our lives as we are living it. The psychiatrist and spiritual director Gerald May lends some helpful insight that I want to draw upon, because I believe that it can assist us as we begin to think about how we do this inner work alongside of our work in the world. In his book, Will and Spirit, A Contemplative Psychology, he explores how we each are balancing our own particular combination of willfulness, making things happen, and willingness, appreciating what is. So I'm going to expand on that as I read a selection from the book. He writes, "Willingness and willfulness cannot be explained in a few words, for they are very subtle qualities, often overlapping and very easily confused with each other. But we can begin by saying that willingness implies a surrendering of one's self-separateness and entering into an immersion in the deepest processes of life itself. It is a realization that one already is a part of some ultimate cosmic process. In contrast, willfulness is the setting of oneself apart from the fundamental essence of life in an attempt to master, direct, control, or otherwise manipulate existence. More simply, willingness is saying yes to the mystery of being alive in each moment. Willfulness is saying no, or perhaps more commonly, yes, but. Now, since he knows his readers, or his hearers in this instant, are already beginning to ask questions, he adds, "It is obvious that we cannot say yes to everything we encounter. Many specific things and situations in life are terribly destructive and must be resisted. But willingness and willfulness do not apply to specific things or situations. They reflect instead the underlying attitude one has towards the wonder of life itself. Willingness notices this wonder and bows in some kind of reverence to it. Willfulness forgets it, ignores it, or at worst actively destroys it." Because I have actually met Gerald or Jerry May as well during my graduate work in clinical psychology, his words do not seem so esoteric to me because he actually embodied them. I knew that he spent his time helping people in mental hospitals and in a prison restore some balance in their own life between willingness and willfulness. I know that for him, spirituality was just as practical as the psychiatry that he practiced. I know personally willfulness so well. Lean in, I'm doing a personal confession. I've had a predisposition mostly, I would say, like that wind-up toy that has been wound up too tight and sputters all over the place in what can seem very sporadic. I want to get things done. I want to make things happen. And I want it all to happen right now. Do I have any company in this? Okay. Could it be that we're all like that character, Zorba, trying to hurry the caterpillar along, trying to hurry our lives along, trying to make things happen beyond their capacity to happen at their own pace? But I think that we can balance our willfulness, our hurriedness, as we practice intentionally some practices of willingness, practices such as prayer or meditation or soul-to-soul conversation with another, journaling, taking a walk in nature, or just being in the silence. No one in our culture is necessarily going to give you that advice, because our tendency is to hurry things along. Our tendency is this willfulness to make things happen. Now, since this is the first time that I've stood before you following our congregational summit, I do want to make a connection between that and my topic this morning. It might feel like I just swerved the car a little, and I have. But I want to stay with that event that is so present with me. A few weeks ago now, 70 or so of us met together on a Friday evening and a Saturday for this reimagining and reclaiming our future summit of the congregation. How many of you were there? Let's just see some hands. Yeah, look around. Okay. Yeah. So this was a time for us to make sense of where this congregation has been during the lifetimes of those that were present in the room. It was a time to get a big picture of what moment in history, what this moment in history is calling this congregation towards, and owning it, not moaning it. It's discerning what directions you as a congregation are willing to move towards. There were a number of poignant moments in the room during that summit. Of course, it was one of the few times where so many of us gathered together in one room for such an extended time of focused conversation and listening to one another since the pandemic. It was a time where people made connections with one another and made connections with people they had not yet met. And one of the most poignant moments for me, I remember, was when standing before that group mind map that captured the collective wisdom of the room about the emerging trends, challenges, and opportunities that present themselves to this congregation. This multicolored graphic indicated some of the ways that the congregation felt they needed to respond. What are the things it needed to respond to as it imagines, reimagines, and shapes its future? That was both an exciting moment and a sobering one. It was sobering to realize that the world of the early 1960s and even the early 1990s no longer exists. That this is not a back to the future time or moment that we're in. But this is a time indeed of reimagining the future and having the willingness to respond. Can we be willing to accept the moment that we're in? Can we be willing to enter the unfolding process that we can contribute to as we move forward? Can we stand in our capacity to live out these words of a favorite Unitarian hymn based on a poem written by James Russell Lowell? New occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncouth. They must upward still and onward, who would keep abreast of truth. He adds, concludes the poems with this verse, not attempt the future's portal with the past's blood-rusted key. So over the next few months, we're going to be gathering in small groups to make sense of these directions that we came up with as a congregation. People will be gathering, and you'll learn more about this in the e-news, to begin to think of projects and action steps that we can take in order to actually move forward in those directions that we claimed as our common ground vision. Can we allow ourselves to imagine that, as the instructions say, that we have 5 years to develop each of those directions, that we don't have to do it all at once. In my experience, as many congregationists approach that, they think they can do everything at once, all at once. They can think that because we've said it, it will actually happen. And I remind people, some of you may have heard me say this before, that it's only in that first book of Genesis that someone says, "Let there be light," and there was light. So we need to figure out what are the steps we're actually willing to propose to one another as we imagine our future together. I hope that we have a willingness to enter the gradual process of change toward what wants to unfold in this congregation, in this community, over the next 5 years. We gather here because we are indeed wounded by the kind of world in which we're often encouraged to live hurriedly. We gather here because we do not want to be cut off from the sources that can reignite in us a sense of our whole life. We gather here because life itself stops us in our tracks, slows us down as we encounter inevitable grief, loss, and a dissolving sense of our exterior self. We gather here so that we can listen to the tender parts of ourselves rather than scrape them off the plate like scraps of life, rather than recognizing that these are an essential part of life itself as well. We gather here because of all that is our life.